December 1944. A quiet sector of the front near the Sauer River, Luxembourg. Freezing fog hangs thick over the snow, hiding the jagged craters and frozen pine trees. 200 meters of frozen mud separate the American lines from the German trenches. It is Christmas morning, but the men keep their frozen fingers wrapped around the triggers of their rifles. Suddenly, a clear voice cuts through the bitter air from across no man's land, singing the familiar melody of Silent Night. The American soldiers listen in total disbelief as the German words float over the frost. One by one, the Americans lower their weapons, and a lone American private begins singing the English translation back into the cold. For 3 minutes, the battlefield falls silent as the two enemies sing the exact same song across the dead zone. General Patton will soon face a choice that changes everything. This is the story of what Patton did when both sides started singing Silent Night across no man's land on Christmas. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. Private Thomas Miller, 19 years old, from a small farming community outside Lincoln, Nebraska, belonged to Company B of the 318th Infantry Regiment. Back home, Miller had been a quiet boy who helped his father harvest corn and sang in the church choir every Sunday morning. He had enlisted because he believed it was his duty. But 3 months in the freezing mud of Western Europe had stripped away his youthful innocence. He had seen his best friend cut down by artillery fire just 3 weeks prior near Metz, leaving him with an empty chest and a constant, aching chill in his bones. On this freezing morning, the bitter cold reminded him entirely of the bitter winters back in Nebraska, a place that felt a million miles away. He sat in his shallow, snow-filled foxhole, with his hands wrapped tightly around a cold steel rifle, staring out into the gray emptiness of no man's land, simply waiting for the day to begin. Across that same frozen field sat Lieutenant Werner Voss, a 26-year-old platoon leader from Berlin, serving in the 212th Volksgrenadier Division. Voss was a committed veteran of the Eastern Front, a man whose ideology was as rigid as the frozen ground beneath his boots. He wore a heavy, tailored wool coat that remained remarkably clean despite the dirt of the trenches, and a polished iron cross hung proudly from his collar. Voss believed entirely that total devotion to the fatherland was the only virtue that mattered, often telling his subordinates that sentimentality was a disease that destroyed a soldier's will to fight. He viewed the Americans across the field not just as enemies, but as soft, unseasoned boys who lacked the hardened resolve of the German warrior class. Yet, as the first light of dawn broke through the gray clouds, the profound cold reminded him of his own family kitchen, prompting him to step onto the fire step and look out at the silent American line. By December 1944, the European theater had devolved into a massive, grinding conflict of endurance through one of the coldest winters on record. To the north, the Ardennes offensive raged in what would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge, drawing the vast majority of Allied armor, artillery, and tactical attention. Along the Sauer River, however, the front lines remained deceptively stable, a quiet sector where exhausted units were sent to hold positions or recover from previous engagements. The supply lines for both armies were stretched to their absolute limits, with frozen roads and constant fog preventing regular airdrops or rapid transportation of hot food and dry winter gear. In these isolated sectors, a strange and unspoken understanding often had developed between the opposing trenches, where men simply tried to survive the sub-zero temperatures. Many mid-level officers on both sides chose to turn a blind eye to small, minor infractions during these stagnant periods. Commanders knew that their men were fighting frostbite just as much as they were fighting the enemy, and small deviations from strict military protocol were frequently tolerated to preserve basic morale. A stray shot that missed on purpose, or an unannounced delay in morning harassment fire, was rarely reported up the chain of command. The overarching objective for these secondary units was simply to hold the line avoid unnecessary casualties, and wait for the massive operations in the north to decide the ultimate fate of the winter campaign. Yet, this fragile, unwritten balance between survival and active combat could not last forever in a war that demanded absolute hostility at all times. The heavy silence that had settled over the snow-covered trenches near the Sauer River was about to be broken by an event that no standard manual could possibly account for. Captain Robert Evans, a 32-year-old company commander from Columbus, Ohio, walked into the forward command post, his breath freezing in the air. He found Lieutenant Voss sitting near a small kerosene stove, sipping from a metal cup. Evans dropped a printed copy of the morning report onto the wooden table. He looked at the German officer, his face completely expressionless. "We have an unusual situation on the line this morning, Lieutenant. The men in your sector have ceased all hostile activity." Voss looked up from his cup, a cold smile touching his lips. "It is Christmas morning, Captain. My men are merely observing the holy day, as any civilized soldiers should." Evans leaned over the table, placing his palms flat on the wood. "Your men are standing on the parapets, Lieutenant. They are singing carols across the dead zone with the American soldiers. This is an unauthorized cessation of hostilities." The German officer stood up slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored wool coat. "It is not an infraction to remember home, Captain. The songs provide a brief moment of comfort in this miserable wilderness. My men are homesick, not rebellious. They simply recognize that some traditions are older than this uniform. The regulations do not permit holiday exceptions, Lieutenant. You know the standing orders for this sector. We are required to maintain full combat readiness and engage any visible targets. You need to order your men back into their trenches immediately and resume standard defensive protocols." Voss shook his head, his posture stiffening with deep aristocratic pride. "I will not issue that order, Captain. My men are veterans of the Eastern Front, and they understand honor far better than your raw conscripts. We are Germans, and we do not discard our heritage just because an American officer is uncomfortable with a moment of peace. If your boys want to sing along with us, let them. This is a direct violation of command policy, Werner. I am giving you a formal directive to clear the parapets. If you refuse, I will have no choice but to report this up the chain of command as a deliberate failure to engage the enemy. Report whatever you wish, Robert. My decision remains exactly as it stands. A true soldier knows when to hold his ground, and today we hold our song. No one is pulling a trigger until the sun goes down. And your regulations cannot change the reality of what the men feel." Evans stared at him for a long moment, then picked up the morning report. He walked quickly over to the field telephone hanging on the timber wall, cranked the handle forcefully, and waited for the operator to connect him to headquarters. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the forward command post within the hour. 4 stars gleamed on his helmet, and the ivory revolvers sat securely on his belt. The general walked in unannounced, his presence immediately freezing the room. He studied the German officer for a silent moment, his cold eyes taking in every detail of the clean wool coat and the polished iron cross. Patton stood by the timber wall, his voice quiet but carrying immense weight. "Lieutenant, did you refuse a direct command to clear the parapets this morning?" Voss stood at rigid attention, his chin held high. "I did, General. My men are simply celebrating Christmas." "Are your men actively holding positions on top of the trenches, Lieutenant?" "They are singing carols, sir. They are not committing any hostile acts against your front lines. And you believe a holiday supersedes your sworn military obligation to engage the enemy forces?" "I believe that some traditions are older than this conflict, General. My men are human beings, not unfeeling machines." Patton stepped closer, his face completely hardened. "You think you are a humanitarian, Lieutenant. You stand here in a tailored coat, looking out over a frozen field, and you believe your appreciation for music makes you superior to the regulations of war. You call it a tradition, But it is nothing more than a temporary luxury. You want to pretend the world has stopped turning because it is December 25th. The reality is that your men are homesick. Voss. They are cold, they are tired, and they are terrified of what lies ahead in the coming months. The American boys across that field feel the exact same emptiness in their chests. They are 19 years old, far from Nebraska, and surviving on frozen rations while they watch their friends die in the snow. The difference between us is not that we feel, Lieutenant. The difference is why we fight. By allowing this spectacle, you have not saved their souls. You have merely given them a few minutes to remember exactly what they are going to lose when the artillery starts firing again. You have weakened their resolve under the guise of an ancient heritage. You have two options now, Lieutenant. Order your men back into the trenches immediately, and tell them to prepare for combat readiness, or I will remove you from this command and let the war resume without your permission. Decide in the next 10 seconds. Voss looked at the floor, his aristocratic pride completely shattered, and nodded silently. The order was given quietly, passing down through the frozen chain of command until it reached the snow-filled trenches. Private Miller watched from his foxhole as the German soldiers slowly lowered themselves from the Proptitzus, their voices trailing off into the bitter winter wind. The sudden absence of the music left a heavy, ringing silence across the 200 meters of no man's land. American infantrymen stood frozen in their positions, their fingers returning slowly to the cold steel triggers of their rifles. There were no shouts, no celebratory cheers, and no dramatic gestures from either side of the line. The small kerosene stoves continued to burn low in the bunkers, casting dim shadows against the packed earth. Officers on both sides stood watchfully, staring out over the frozen craters as the fragile truce evaporated into the gray morning fog. The frontline observers checked their watches as the hands moved steadily forward, marking the final minutes of the unauthorized peace. No tactical advantage had been gained, and no ground had been lost during those fleeting minutes of shared melody. The witnesses in the surrounding foxholes simply watched the empty field, fully aware that the brief warmth had vanished completely. The heavy gray clouds hung low over the Sauer River as the war resumed its standard, grinding rhythm at precisely 1200 hours. Private Miller returned home to Lincoln, Nebraska, after the Army discharged him in late 1945. He married his childhood sweetheart, took over his family's corn farm, and lived a quiet life completely removed from military affairs. He never spoke about the cold morning near the Sauer River to his neighbors, but his family noted that he always sang Silent Night with a profound, unbroken intensity every Christmas Eve. He passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1998, leaving behind 3 children and a farm that had thrived for decades. Lieutenant Voss faced a military tribunal in early 1946 for his actions during the final months of the winter campaign. He served 4 years in a civilian detention facility near Munich before earning his release during the Reconstruction era. He returned to a ruined Berlin, working quietly as a clerk in a local supply warehouse until his retirement. Voss remained a bitter, isolated man who frequently complained to his few remaining acquaintances about the collapse of the old military hierarchies and the loss of traditional soldierly honor. He died alone in his small apartment in 1974, never having reconciled his rigid wartime ideology with the peaceful reality of the post-war world. General Patton kept the original sector morning report locked in his personal desk drawer until his untimely death in December 1945. He made only one brief mention of the incident in a private letter to his wife, noting that sometimes a commander must understand the limits of ammunition. His personal diary recorded that a general must occasionally allow his men to remember what they are protecting before sending them back into the modern slaughterhouse. Some historians have argued that General Patton's decision to permit a temporary local truce along the Sauer River was a dangerous breach of standard operational security. They maintain that a commanding officer should never allow sentimental considerations to interfere with tactical readiness, especially during a volatile winter campaign where the enemy could easily exploit any lapse in vigilance. Others have argued the opposite, defending the action as a brilliant display of practical leadership that preserved the psychological endurance of his exhausted frontline units. They suggest that withholding combat orders for a few hours did not alter the strategic balance of the sector, but instead provided a vital moment of psychological relief that ultimately strengthened the resolve of the men. What is certain is that the brief ceasefire near Luxembourg remains one of the most remarkable instances of localized military restraint recorded during the entire winter campaign of 1944. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have ordered the sector back to combat readiness immediately, without the delay? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.